We've learned the basics of what the fungus ergot is, and now we know that the concept of the microcosm and macrocosm is all around us because of God's design. So, what does this mean for our developing case for LSD? I'm glad you asked, because it's so much more than you imagined. Let's take a look all the way in the beginning in Genesis. Adam and Eve had eaten the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, and God cursed both the serpent and Adam and Eve. What is particularly interesting is the curse God placed on Adam. Not only did he curse Adam, he cursed the ground because Adam was made from the ground. The curse in Genesis 3 reads as follows: "Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." What are thorns and thistles? What's interesting is that if you look at the original Hebrew word for thistle, the description has nothing to do with any prickly plant. The word is dardar. Of course, the ancient Hebrew language from Genesis has some differences to current Hebrew, so even with this word, there can be some aspects of translation that don't capture its full essence. When I did some digging on this word dardar, it's interesting how the possible definitions can be pretty vague. There is a consistency, though, in the characteristics of this plant. The Gesenius states this is a luxuriantly growing but useless plant. The word can be traced to the bilateral root dalet resh, which is defined mainly as movement without hindrance or duress. The root word can also be traced to a free-moving bird or a swift flight. Interpreters don't find that a bird in itself fits the context of this passage, which makes sense. We can only do our best to interpret what exactly this word could mean, since the closest we can get to a specific word is just its main characteristic. This is a plant that moves freely, like a bird that flies wherever it wants. It has a swift flight. What does this remind you of? I believe it can describe weeds for sure. A thistle is a type of weed. It fits the description of the curse when we look at the context. The ground is being cursed, and Adam is told that he will have to work hard to just grow his food. Thorns and weeds and other plants that are useless, that aren't good for food and just consume and destroy wherever they go, would play a part in making it hard for mankind to grow food. The second part of the curse is that you shall eat the herb of the field, which is used in connection to thorns and thistles. What is a plant that encompasses all of these qualities besides a weed? A plant that brings harm to crops or to humans in general. It moves swiftly, takes flight like a bird, has no home so it grows randomly, and cannot be controlled. A plant that grows luxuriantly so it can even look beautiful and extravagant. Lastly, it's mentioned in conjunction to the necessity of eating herbs of the field. What can make you sick or create imbalance in your hormones, nervous system, or immune system so that the eating of medicinal herbs is the natural remedy to heal the body? The answer is fungus, and ergot is the epitome of the curse's descriptions. Now, not all fungi is bad for the body. However, they are known for being this paradoxical type of plant having both good and negative effects on the body. There are many that are completely poisonous and detrimental to crops and the body. Even the good ones are prone to carry toxins, can cause allergic reactions, and range in how dangerous they can be. No more than 10% of mushroom species, for example, in the world are considered actually edible, and there are still so many species that have not been classified. It's interesting how even yeast, which is also a fungus, creates leavened bread. Leavened bread is often used as a symbol of uncleanness or infiltration of sin in the Bible. The showbread in the temple, or the bread of the presence, was unleavened. High levels of yeast in particularly women's bodies is directly linked to hormonal imbalances and in turn infertility. Mold, which is a fungus, causes respiratory problems, chronic inflammation, rashes, infections, and can lead to even neurological problems. God even created a law in the Old Testament on how to deal with mold. It was considered unclean and had to be inspected by a priest. And if the mold reappeared after the cleaning, the house had to be torn down. It's interesting how now there are many theories of the Jews having hallucinations of God and Jesus and making the whole Bible based on eating ergot-infested bread. Remember, ergot is a type of mold. Not only is there no historical evidence for this whatsoever, this completely contradicts the fact that God demanded cleanliness in his people. In the last part of the curse, God says how in the sweat of man's face he will eat bread until he returns to the ground. Bread didn't even exist for Adam and Eve before the fall because it wasn't necessary. They were receiving all the nutrients and satisfaction they needed from the fruit of the trees in the garden. They didn't have to work to eat. The plants and the trees produced food for them, and all they needed to do was pluck it. But because of sin, now humankind had to work for their food, which means they needed food that provided carbs and protein that lasted longer in the body to fuel strenuous labor. Real natural bread has specific nutrients and combinations of nutrients that fruits and vegetables don't necessarily carry all in one substance. Fruits release energy providing sugars in the body in short bursts. But for the body that is laboring, it requires more to give it endurance, something that lasts longer just from a smaller piece of that food. With the curse, now humans had to work hard, and their bodies would greatly desire this new food called bread. The body was to be caught in this cycle, needing to work exhaustively to grow wheat and make it into bread, and needing the bread to restore the strength required to make the bread. Sin creates a time loop of unrest. When Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, they essentially told God and the entire spirit realm that God's provided fruit that he allowed them to eat wasn't good enough for them. They wanted more. So now they had to create their own fruit, because now they got what they asked for by wanting to be as God. Wheat is essentially a fruit too, because the wheat germ comes from a flower. It is a flowering plant. Let's go even further. We know that in the curse, God mentions how man came from the ground and was made of dust and is dust, so that is where he will return. The microcosm here is that wheat represents man and his body, because it is the new food born from the fall that also comes from the ground, the new fallen form away from God's presence. This is why wheat is so high maintenance. It requires several processes before it can eventually turn into delicious, nutritious bread that helps create balanced gut health. One of the many things that is so special about God is that his words echo into eternity. This is why God is known to speak only what he needs to, and he never lies. God's blessings and curses perpetuate and multiply throughout Scripture and are woven into the lives of the Hebrews and the entire world. Because our bodies and all of creation bears witness to God and who he is, the curses are also borne witness to in multiple ways. The flaws in our natural world will always point back to the curse, but they will also point back to the promised blessing and redemption. They all are telling the same story of our fall and our redemption over and over again, with every passing year since the beginning of time. Many people may say, well, the concept of bread really isn't that deep. I think especially with modern day Christians, many view the concept of the spiritual depths of food as being a religious, over-spiritual, or even New Age idea. But if we look at the Bible and history itself, this just isn't factual. The very act that separated us from God was sin by the act of eating. So how can we say that God didn't create significance to it? If we examine with an open heart, we won't be legalistic about what we consume, but we will be free in understanding God's heart for us and how special and holy he intended us to be, not to hurt us or restrict us, but to come back to the fullness of who we are as his own. It is undeniable that bread is important to God because he made it important to us. Take, for example, the bread of the presence. or the showbread that was kept in the temple in the Old Testament. It was specifically in the holy place, which was the room right outside of where the Ark of the Covenant was located and separated by a veil. God required that 12 loaves of bread would be kept in the tabernacle on a table with bowls of frankincense. These 12 loaves were separated into 2 piles of 6 loaves each. Now, we already know that the bread represents the new food that came from the fall, the way to replenish from the newly required hard labor. We also know that wheat and bread itself represents the new fallen body after sin, being the microcosm. The fact that the loaves were separated into 2 piles of 6 also signifies the fallen body of man. 6 in Hebrew is the number of man. It is 1 short of the perfect number of rest, 7. So this holy bread represents the merging of the flesh and the spirit, just as eating the forbidden fruit was the merger of Adam and Eve to sin and their newly twisted revelation on godliness and who they were. The communion of eating the bread bridges these connections because bread is the food of the fallen based on the curse. It couldn't be, say, a peach, because this wasn't the new food that was formed from the curse from mankind's new fallen form. Because bread is the new required food of the humans due to sin, so that was the food required to eat and offer on the table of the presence to come into agreement with God. It also was how the Hebrews came into agreement with the eventual sacrifice of Jesus' body. Jesus was the bread of life, because his body was the perfect merger of the flesh and the Spirit of God, God in the flesh, and because Jesus is the bread that you don't have to labor for to receive healing and rejuvenation to the body, brain, and emotions. This showbread was literally in Hebrew, the bread of faces. This signifies the person of Jesus. Humankind saw the face of God tangibly through Jesus, since no man has looked upon the face of the Father at any time according to the Bible. Once again, the crossover of spirit to the flesh. This showbread was on a table made of acacia wood, which is known for its durability and resistance to contamination and decay. The bread was made of the finest flour. This wasn't just grain that was sifted so many times and ground up so many times to be as fine as possible, but also the cleanest flour. And it was accompanied with the bowls of burning frankincense. What is so significant about frankincense is that it not only was a beautiful fragrance, it has strong antibacterial properties. It is known to kill germs in the atmosphere, including fungus and forms of mold, etc. It has been used to heal wounds, conditions like asthma, digestive problems, and hormonal problems in women. By setting up this showbread every week and changing it out every Sabbath or rest day, the Jews were saying to God that they trusted him to provide for them clean bread, healthy food, and to heal their entire being, soul, body, and spirit, and that he'd send the ultimate healing to the world, Jesus. As you can see, God was not playing when he was talking about clean versus unclean. It wasn't just about spiritual cleanness. It was about the things that entered this world through sin that create holding places in our body for disease, deficiencies, and imbalance. We can see in Leviticus 24:7 that bread is also a memorial, which means it's a stronghold for the soul, which bridges the gap between the spirit and the flesh. A memorial acts as a staple that is held so deeply in the soul that other beliefs, emotions, thoughts, and decisions flow from this place. Because the Jews didn't have the outpour of the Holy Spirit yet to completely indwell and transform their souls, they had to partake in the acts of the prophetic witness to this future event, to agree with God's plans. Traditions built into one's subconscious. The more we act on a habit, the more it builds into our subconscious and reprograms us. That way, when we see something or someone that reminds us of this tradition, or is the reason for this tradition, even if consciously we aren't aware, we are likely to easily gravitate towards and believe this something or someone. This is one of the things that God was doing with the Hebrews in preparation for Jesus. Traditions and God's way will combat hardest Traditions in God's way will combat hardness of heart, unbelief, and lack of discernment and revelation so that we can recognize Jesus. Traditions in man's way creates the hardness of heart, unbelief, lack of discernment and revelation, and sets us up to think we recognize Jesus when really we are recognizing the Antichrist. For example, what got in the way of the Jews knowing Jesus was the prophesied Messiah when he did come was the oral traditions of the law, or the Talmud, from the Pharisees, which caused the Jews to have trouble recognizing who Jesus was. This was what Jesus referred to as the leaven of the Pharisees, the fungus of the Pharisees. This was a memorial that was set up in the people's hearts as a stumbling block and was created by prideful men. Even though the truth had enough evidence in front of their very faces, many could not believe. More evidence of what bread does to the soul spiritually and naturally is in Judges 19 verse 5. It states, "Then it came to pass on the fourth day that they arose early in the morning, and he stood to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, 'Refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way.' The bread refreshes the heart and the center of the man. This center is the soul, the will, emotions, and the intellect of a person. It is hard to fathom this in modern-day industrial society where bread has been mixed with so many artificial ingredients to give it a long shelf life and fulfill greed, but truly natural bread balances the gut in such a way that it helps create healthy emotional and psychological patterns. It has tremendous health benefits to the brain and all the other organs. And the healthier we are in our souls, the easier it is to hear and receive from God. Remember, what we experience and see and hear in the natural is just a microcosm of the spiritual realm. So imagine what this all means when Jesus said he is the bread of life and instructed his disciples to eat of his body. Jesus wasn't just talking about coming into agreement with him being the sacrifice for their sins. He was talking about, once again, being the healer to their whole being, including their emotions, their minds, and their physical bodies. Jesus, the bread of life, was free from sin and all forms of perversion, what we can consider spiritual mold, and because of this, heals us physically and spiritually. There are multiple verses that uses bread in connotation to a deep soul emotion or state of being that contaminates an entire person. These include distress, affliction, tears, the bread of tears, deceit, a miser, etc. Proverbs 23:6-8 warns of eating bread characterized by an evil intent, although it seems beneficial. It says, "Do not eat the bread of a miser, nor desire his delicacies, for as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. The morsel you have eaten you will vomit up and waste your pleasant words." This is because eating bread with others in the Bible formed an agreement, a covenant, or a common destiny. Just like when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit together and it brought them to a common covenant of sin. In Ezekiel 4 verse 13, God warns of the contamination of the bread of the Gentiles. It states, "Then the Lord said, so shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, where I will drive them." Because they had sinned against God and continued to go after idols and engage in the occult rituals of the foreigners, God said they will be forced to eat unclean things in this foreign land. Having to eat unclean food or contaminated bread, both figuratively and literally, is a sign of the curse of disobedience, idolatry, and witchcraft. This is also shown in Deuteronomy 28 verse 17, after God lists all the blessings that will come with obedience to God's laws. He begins to list all the curses if they fall away, and one of them is that their basket and kneading bowl will be cursed, specifically the bread basket. God could have said their plates of cooked lamb would be cursed, but no, he said specifically their process of making bread would be cursed. Proverbs 20 verse 17 says, "Bread of deceit is sweet to a man, but afterwards his mouth shall be filled with gravel." The actual physical manifestation of this is seen with the Egyptians. They were known to make bread that had bits of gravel in it because of how they pound the grain. There have been mummies found where archaeologists saw a common situation of people with teeth that were damaged from this. The Egyptians were deceived by worshiping multiple gods, so you can see how this verse correlates with that. Our God taught the Hebrews how to prepare clean bread and clean food in general, so as to prevent these things that harm the body. It's clear to see the spiritual and natural significance of wheat and bread and how they connect. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have such a war on bread, especially in the United States, where the church at large has also grown apart from the Old Testament and believe that the Old Covenant is simply done away with. The spiritual powers of darkness know that the more they detach us from understanding the ways God speaks to us and how He's created us through things such as seemingly minuscule things like bread, the further they can keep us from the truth. We live in a synthetic society where everything is either completely artificial or the natural is mixed with the artificial. It's no wonder how New Age spirituality and other forms of Luciferian ideology emphasize the yin and the yang, the darkness and the light meeting one another and moving as one and mixing. This is because in the fallen state, that is what the body knows. This is what Adam and Eve essentially began to believe and what caused them to eat the forbidden fruit in the first place. They had begun to mix their previous perception of God, that He was their loving Father, with the concept that He was also keeping secrets, that God was double-minded and was two-faced, that He was mixed with good and evil. Humankind's belief in this lie and the attempts to become like God has created this reality of the time loop of good mixed with bad. But when we look through the eyes of God, we can see that there are only two categories, good and evil. This is why, even with LSD's origins being ergot, we can justify it in our minds and say, well, certain properties were removed, so if I take LSD, my limbs won't fall off. Humankind has a tendency to try to redeem things like we are God Himself, when He has already shown us when something is harmful. Even pharmaceutical medications that use ergot alkaloids come with side effects similar to ergotism, such as disturbing hallucinations, respiratory problems, vomiting, etc. Although it's not as harsh. God said in Genesis 3 to Adam that he would return to the ground because of out of it he was taken, for dust he is, and to dust he will return. God spoke there Himself the spiritual truth that things in their fallen state will always go back to what their original lowest form is. There is no denying that or escaping the truth or anyone or anything's original form that He created. There is no escaping the true form of ergot alkaloids. Although we can synthesize it and try to make it more pleasant or pure through LSD, we will see by its fruit in the end the death and destruction that will follow. See you on the next episode.